Greetings! So this lesson is on pie charts. In the last lesson, I talked about line graphs, which are where you obviously primarily talk about changes over time. Now, pie charts questions like bar graphs or tables are different in that they don't present continuous data, like a line graph. They may present data at specific points in time, or they may not. So these three types of question are a bit trickier in that you have to identify whether you're talking about changes between points in time, or differences between categories where there's no reference to time, or possibly both of those things. So the reason why this lesson is so long, and if you look at the lesson notes underneath the video on the website, you'll see, is that here is where I primarily talk about what these differences are and how you recognize them and how you deal with them. So all of the information in this particular lesson also applies to the following three lessons, which are on bar graphs, tables, and multiple graphs. So if you understand essentially how to write about line graphs, as well as all the information in this particular lesson, then you know all of the information that you need to apply to answer any graphs question correctly in IELTS Task 1. So if you spend quite a lot of time on lesson 4 and this lesson 5, the following lessons get easier, and it's just a matter of applying the information from this lesson in those different contexts. So again, it's much easier to understand the kind of abstract principles behind how you answer a particular type of Task 1 question by specifically going through different answers. So that's what I'm going to do. So we're going to have a look first at a couple of questions and then look at one in detail. So here's a question with two different pie charts. Like line graphs, you may get 2, 3, 4, or more pie charts to talk about. So again, the total information that you need to discuss is not more or less, it's just that it's presented in different ways. So if we have a look here, the first chart below shows how energy is used in an average Australian household. The second chart shows the greenhouse gas emissions which result from this energy use. So there's your introduction, just introducing those two pieces of information about these different pie charts. So again, the first one, Australian household energy use and Australian household greenhouse gas emissions. So the categories are the same: water heating, heating, cooling. So those are all the same, and you just need to talk about the differences in the categories for the two different situations: household energy use and greenhouse gas emissions. So if you look at the numbers of pieces of information, how many categories are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 different categories, 2 different pie charts. That's 12 pieces of information. You'll often get this with pie charts where it's really quite easy to mention each slice of the pie for however many pie charts there are. So 12 pieces of information. So again, you might be able to combine certain ones depending on, if you look at cooling, lighting in both sections, they are, quite small percentages, although lighting does increase. You've got 12 pieces of information, and simply describing them is what you want to do. Now, are these things related? Yes and no. You definitely wouldn't consider an increase, so if you look at household energy use and greenhouse gas, let's look at heating. It's 42% of energy use and 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. Water heating is 30% of energy use and 32% of greenhouse gas emissions. So what you want to talk about is the differences in those. So while heating makes up 42% of household energy use, it only accounts for 15% of household greenhouse gas emissions. So making these types of comparisons is what you want to do. You wouldn't want to just describe one graph and then describe the other ones. Then you've just got a list of things. So the majority of household energy is used for heating, then followed by water heating at 30% and other appliances at 15%, and then refrigeration at 7%, cooling, lighting at 4%, and cooling at 2%. That's just a list of the things. Now you need to make comparisons. So this, where it says summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So this is the type of question, pie charts questions or bar graph questions with no reference to time, where making comparisons is the essence of what you're doing. So how would you divide the information? That comes up. So, if you wouldn't have one body paragraph about household energy use and another one about greenhouse gas emissions, what you need to do is divide these categories logically. Now, it could be the case that it's just, you divide them randomly. You could choose ones that are large percentages of either or both. You could choose them randomly. You could find some type of logic within the pie chart categories. Again, if we look, it's all about energy use, so there are 6. So let's just choose 3 for each category. So let's say heating, water heating, and cooling. Those seem slightly related. Lighting, other appliances, and refrigeration. So those are our 2 groups. So we're going to talk about, let's just consider that's one body paragraph, first or second, doesn't really matter. And that's the second one. To me, that seems logical. If you found grouping them in a different way, there's no particular order here that is much more logical than the other. But to me, that seemed logical, grouping them that way. As long as it's clear and you're doing it so it's, you're grouping them in a way that you're making comparisons between the two. So you don't want one paragraph where you just describe this and the other paragraph where you just describe this, because that doesn't allow this. That doesn't allow this making comparisons. So that is rather messy. So if you think about what's your overview, it's the greatest proportion of energy use in the first one and the greatest proportion of greenhouse gas emissions in the second one. So our overview could be something like, you could talk about greatest and least. So the greatest proportion of household energy use was spent on heating and water heating, while the greatest proportion of household greenhouse gas emissions was the result of water heating and the use of other appliances. Again, you could add one other, small fact about the lower ones. For both household energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, cooling was responsible for the lowest number. Something like that, where you're talking about the main factors and the factors which account for the least energy use and gas emissions, add some balance and depth to your overview. So here's another one, pie chart. Now this one is the one that I'm going to go over from the website. It's one that doesn't deal with time at all. But for this one, you can see time is an issue. So you've got 2 categories, Yemen and Italy, and 2 dates, 2000 and 2050. So one is about predictions for the future, and one is about what the data was in 2000. And then, the categories that you've got here are 0 to 14 years, 15 to 59, and 60 plus. So that's what you're going to talk about. So if you think about what are the changes that you need to talk about, that's within these age groups, within these countries, and within these 2 time frames. So this is one where you have to talk about both differences in time and differences in categories and differences between countries. So how would you organize this one? Well, if you think about, the details that you're going to offer first, there's 3 pieces of information in each of these boxes. So the data for each of these 3 age groups in 4 different periods, or in 2 different periods and 2 different places. So that's 12 pieces of information. So again, most likely, unless they're really similar in one place or another, we're just going to talk about all of them. In terms of our overview, what's the main thing that happened? So what's the main thing that's predicted to happen with Italy, and what's the main thing that's predicted to happen with Yemen? So if we look at Italy, sorry, if we look at Yemen, what increases and what decreases? So 60 plus years increases in Yemen. 15 to 59 years increases in Yemen. 0 to 14 decreases in Yemen. So in Yemen, it's predicted that the number of people aged 15 to 60 and 60 plus will increase, while the number of 0 to 14-year-olds will decrease. And if we look at the same information in Italy, people aged 60 or more is forecast to increase, while the other 2 population groups are forecast to decrease. Again, we've already mentioned what those are, 0 to 14 and 15 to 59. So again, we've talked about the main changes that are going to happen, right? So it's essentially what's increasing and what's decreasing in each of these countries. For the overview in this one, the simplest thing to do is simply choose what happened in each category in each country and talk about that. And in terms of how do we group the data, so here we clearly want to make comparisons between each country. So having one body paragraph or one details paragraph about the year 2000 and then another one about the year 2050 is going to be very easy in terms of the information, being able to compare it. So, you know, the age group 0 to 14 was 50.1% in Yemen, the highest number in Yemen, whereas it was the lowest number in Italy at 14.3%. The lowest number in Yemen was for 60 plus years, which was blah, 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 blah. So making these comparisons between Italy and Yemen in the various age groups in 2000. That's what we want to do. And essentially, there's enough data where we can easily report all of it. And it all seems relevant here. So there aren't any real, you know, groups that we can just put together, different age groups, because they're roughly the same. So they're all different in differing ways between countries. So just describe that. So if you think about grammar, you know, you're going to be using the past tense to talk about this part, which is another reason to organize it this way. Your second details paragraph will be about what's going to happen in the future. So it's predicted that in the future, the number of people aged between 0 and 14 years will decrease in both countries from 50 to 37% in Yemen and from approximately 14 to approximately 12% in Italy. Those aged 60 and over, on the other hand, are predicted to increase for both countries from 3% to around 6% in Yemen and from 24.1 to 42% in Italy. So again, if you talk about things this way, your overview talks about, you know, what happens in the two countries in terms of the various changes of population within each country. Now that's important, and that's the general idea that this question is getting across. But again, we want to make comparisons, so dividing our details paragraph this way, where we talk about about the differences between Italy and Yemen in 2000, and about the predicted differences and how those numbers will change in each country in 2050, then we've done both. We've talked about changes within each country, within the population groups, and then we've compared differences between the countries and the population groups for various time periods. So that way, we've given all of the information that we need to, and in a way that's clear and can be easily followed. So as I mentioned before, there are different ways to organize information, but you always want to choose an organizational structure that allows you to do what you need to do. So in this case, talking about both, you know, differences within the country between the two time periods and differences between the countries in the different time periods. We want to do both of those things. So this structure will allow us to do that easily and clearly. Whereas if we mix the things up, it's going to be more difficult to follow. So this is one that seems to me that there isn't as much flexibility in how you're going to divide up the information. But again, you might come up with something, and as long as it's clear, it's okay. But I think most successful responses I've seen from students to this question do it that way. And the ones where people try to do it a different way, either they're not making appropriate comparisons, or the numbers are so mixed up between the first paragraph and the second paragraph that it's really difficult to follow. So that's why it's really important to, you know, decide what you need to do. Do you need to make comparisons or talk about changes in time, or both? And then choose an organizational structure that does that, and then make sure that you give the appropriate level of detail and an appropriate summary of the detail in your overview. All right, so if you look in the lesson notes underneath the video on the website IELTScompass.com for this particular lesson, you will find this question, which is the one that I wrote a response to. So if you look at what's it asking us, got 6 pie charts. That seems like a lot, but I mean, if we look here, the charts below show the percentage of the water used for different purposes in 6 areas of the world. So, anything about time? Nope. So it's just comparing 6 regions of the world, 3 different uses of water. 6 times 3 is 18, so there are 18 pieces of data here. So if you go by my, approximately 8 to 12 rule, then you're going to know that, this is one of those ones where I'm not going to have time to discuss every single data point. And if you look more closely at this, as we will, you'll see there are definitely places where you can combine categories to talk about them in the same way so that you only really have to report a significantly smaller amount of data. And so like if you get this a type of question where you just see a lot of different things, a lot of lines on a line graph, a lot of pie charts, first of all, calm down, because you can know that as long as it's a real IELTS question, you can definitely start to put things together in a way that you can describe them more simply. So when I see an IELTS question like this, I immediately start looking for similarities, patterns. And if there are this many data points, and it is a real IELTS question, you will find those similarities and patterns. So first start at, look at the regions: North America, South America, Europe, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. So they're not continents, they're regions. And then if you think, okay, North America, Europe, they look a bit different than South America, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia. If you think like more developed, more industrialized, North America and Europe, less developed, less industrialized, the other four, and all of a sudden there's a pattern. So if you look at the barred diagonal lines for agricultural use, you can see in the developing world, agricultural use is much more, and it's similar levels: South America, Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and it's much less in the more developed parts of the world like North America and Europe, and those numbers are also similar. And again, like if you look, okay, so industrial use of water, that's higher in the industrialized world like North America and Europe. Again, those numbers are similar, around half, and it's much, much lower in the developing world: South America, Africa, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia. So the light blue, it's a much smaller percentage of water use. If we look at the last one, domestic use, it's also reasonably similar between the developing world and the developed world, with a slightly different number for South America, which happens to be the highest. So if we look at the numbers themselves, you can see already that it's going to be fairly easy to combine some of these when we're describing the data. So if you look at agricultural use in the developing world, 84% Africa, 88% Central Asia, 81% Southeast Asia, those are pretty similar numbers, and even 71% for South America is in a similar range. For North America and Europe, 32 and 39%. So again, they're not all that different. For North America and Europe with industrial use of water, the light blue color, 48 versus 53%, so about a half. So those are also very similar. If you look at industrial use in the other four, 10% in South America, 7% in Africa, 5% in Central Asia, 12% in Southeast Asia. So again, the range is quite narrow in that they're all relatively similar. Domestic use, 9% for Africa, 7% for Central Asia, 7% for Southeast Asia. Those are all very similar. For North America and Europe, 13% versus 15%. Again, very similar. And the kind of the outlier, the one that's a bit different, is South America, that has the highest at 19%. So you can see a lot of these numbers, when we're reporting different categories, we're going to be able to combine them and write one sentence that mentions more than one region. The first thing you do when you see your task one question, if it's a graphs question, pie charts, bar graphs, whatever, look at the number of pieces of data. If it's 8, 10, 12, something like that, most likely the easiest and most logical thing to do will be to describe all of the points. And if you get, in the range of, 15 to 20 pieces of data, something like that, that's not uncommon. But don't panic, because you can always find easily identifiable similarities between certain categories, and they will always be there if it's a real IELTS question. So again, with a little bit of practice, it's quite easy to identify these things the way that I just did. So if we have a look at the response, the pie charts show water use for 3 different purposes in 6 different regions of the world. So if you compare that to the question, the charts below show the percentage of water used for different purposes in 6 areas of the world. Reasonably similar, but you just want to introduce what it's about in a slightly different way than is listed in the question. Our overview: overall, the majority of water is used for agricultural purposes in the developing world, while the most water in the developed world is employed in industrial use. So that's what we immediately noticed, right? The light blue color is much bigger in the developed world, and the vertical lines much bigger in the developing world. And then we also mentioned this difference in South America. So South America tops the world in domestic use of water. So that is a very complete overview. It's got all of the information. And again, there's no specific details. There's no data in the overview. It's just a general summary of the information that we see. So again, we've got three different types: industrial use, agricultural use, domestic use. And we want to make comparisons in this particular type of question. So we want to compare use between different regions of the world. So, you've got to either divide it into industrial use and agricultural use versus domestic use, or agricultural use and domestic use versus industrial use, or industrial use and domestic use versus agricultural use. So, two in one and one in the other. In this particular case, it probably doesn't really matter that much. There's no real logical way to divide it. But let's have a look at the first details paragraph. The utilization of water for agricultural purposes is highest in the areas of Africa, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and South America, averaging approximately 80%. So there, averaging approximately 80%, 84, 88, 81, 71. So that's acceptable to do when you've got numbers that fit quite neatly into a close range of different values. Central Asia recorded the highest use with 88%. So again, noting highs and lows is also useful in a question like this. Europe and North America, on the other hand, showed much lower consumption in agricultural settings, each with about a third of the total water utilized. So again, 32 and 39, not exactly a third, about a third. Domestic use was much lower in all regions, ranging from 7% in Africa and Central Asia up to 19% in South America. So domestic use was much lower than the use of water for agricultural purpose in all of the regions. So even in South America, where it's not the lowest, it's lower than for agricultural use. So there we've dealt with agricultural use and domestic use of water. So our last paragraph, our second details paragraph, is going to be about industrial use of water. So turning to use for industrial purposes, Europe and North America recorded the highest figures at 53 and 48% respectively. I could have said at around a half each. That would also be fine. Developing regions of the world consumed much lower amounts of water in industrial fields, from a low of 5% in Central Asia up to a high of 12% in Southeast Asia. So again, I've given this range of 5 to 12%, and they're all within this range. So you can see in lots of these instances, I've combined the data to report overall a smaller number of data points. So let's just count them to see if they fit my 8 to 12 rule. So first one, utilization of water for agricultural purposes highest in these places. That's 1, around 80%. Central Asia had the highest use. That's 2. Europe and North America showed much lower consumption. Mentioning both of those, that's 3 and 4. Oh, sorry, each with about a third, that's 3. Domestic use was much lower in all regions, ranging from 7% in Africa and Central Asia to 19% in South America. So let's say that's 5. 4 and 5, talking about those. Turning to the use for industrial processes, Europe and North America recorded the highest figures at 53 and 48%. There's 6, 7. Developing regions of the world consume much lower amounts of water in industrial fields, from a low of 5% in Central Asia up to a high of 12% in Southeast Asia. So really it's only about 9, 10 pieces of information that I've included, because I've combined all of these. So it's about half the number of data points that are present are specifically discussed, because you can combine them this way. Again, there's no magic number, like don't be counting, trying to find 8 or finding 10 for every one. But if you do your job correctly, and then you go back afterwards and count the number of data points that you mention in your report, it will fit within this 8 to 12 if you've done it correctly. And again, if there are extremes, like you write, you're always only describing 5 or 6 of them, and your report's very short, that tells you that that's why you need to be in that range. Or if you're describing all 18 of these points, first of all, it's going to sound a bit redundant because a lot of the numbers are similar. And second of all, your report is going to be very, very long, right? So this one, 192 words. I've dealt with all of this information in 192 words, which is a reasonable amount to write for this part of the test. Okay, so if you scroll down, you'll see a different second version with cohesive devices, referencing devices, less common or useful vocabulary that you can have a look at. So I went over a bit of what that means in the past lessons. So have a look at that to see some examples of that. This is essentially the same, in both Task 1 courses and the Task 2 course, where this type of vocabulary is highlighted to show you examples of it. And it's good for, just being aware of how often cohesive devices are used, what referencing devices are. You probably use them on your own without thinking about it. And then, you can also use this for a source of good vocabulary for whatever particular topic the essay or the report or the letter is about. So there you have the lesson on pie charts and the different types of data that you can find in the various types of pie charts questions you'll get on the IELTS test. So the next 3 lessons are on tables, bar graphs, and multiple graphs questions. And essentially, we've already covered all of the main differences in the types of data that you'll have to describe. And the next 3 lessons are really just how you would do that in the context of those other ways of presenting data, a table, bar graphs, or multiple graphs. So keep those things in mind. Make sure you do adequate practice of lots of Task 1 questions, and remember that getting a good score in Task 1 for most people is absolutely essential to getting the score that they need overall in the writing test.